This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Energy Hub. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast on virtual power plants, my guest is Scott Vogt, just retired vice president with Illinois utility Commonwealth Edison, and now principal with power sector consultant Vogt Energy Advisors. Scott is going to describe the key features of the two important VPP programs included in Illinois' just enacted landmark Senate Bill 25, the Clean and Reliable Grid Affordability Act, acronymed SURGA. Scott began his career in 1990 as a financial analyst with the University of Chicago Hospitals, and in 1998 he began an almost three-decade career with Commonwealth Edison and Exelon, its parent company. He worked in finance, project evaluation, and policy, and he retired at the end of 2025 as VP of Strategy and Energy Policy. And immediately, by the way, formed Vogt Energy Advisors. So, Scott, your work at ComEd ended with preparing for the rollout of the two SURGA VPP programs mandated by Illinois lawmakers. And this series of podcasts is about VPPs. One of those VPPs mandated was the Seasonal Schedule Dispatch Program, and the other is the long-term VPP program, sometimes called, I think, Storage for All. So can you give us an overview of them by explaining why lawmakers saw a need to do two programs in one bill?
Thanks, Herman, and I really appreciate the invite to come on your show and share some insights with you. And I'm going to back up just a little bit on that question because I want to give you some foundational pieces that I think is important. Is when this conversation started to happen and the developer community and others were reaching out to ComEd, and we started talking about VPPs. And I will just say on an aside, I hate the letters VPPs because I actually don't see these power plants as virtual. They're just real power plants.
Some
And
people like the acronym DPP, Distributed Power Plant. Is that better for you?
I tend to agree with that wholeheartedly, that I don't like to discount them by thinking of them as virtual, as like something that's not tangible and real. But one of the first modifications, and what I think is one of the most important modifications that we had to put in the statute, was we had to change the way what resources qualified to be net metering resources. So when folks were approaching us prior to the legislation, they were like, "Hey, we want to do standalone storage. What can you do as a utility?" And I would say nothing. And they're like, "Well, why is that?" And I said, "We're not empowered to buy the power from your storage device when it comes onto the grid because you're not qualified as a net metering resource. So I don't have any ability to pay you for any electrons that come onto the grid. We only do that with net metering customers." So the first change we had to make, which was a significant one, was to include standalone storage and to include, at the time I decided, well, we might as well think about V2G too, because V2G would have the same problem. And
that's vehicle to grid. V2G is
vehicle to grid.
That means electric vehicles are able to send electricity to the grid when the grid calls for it and needs it.
Yeah, thank you. That's correct. Utility executives, we always speak in acronyms, so I appreciate the clarity. But we needed to enable those devices when they were putting power back on the grid. We needed to be able to pay for the power when it came to us. So that was step one. And then step two was, okay, we've had in Illinois something called the DG rebate, which we developed. I was sort of the father of back in 2014 and 2015 when we first enabled FEJA, the Future Energy Jobs Act, where we would do a distributed generation rebate at $250 per kW of installed DC capacity. And then CEJA added solar plus storage. So then we wanted to add the same rebate for standalone storage. And then we kind of ran into a little bit of a roadblock on on vehicle to grid, because what were we incentivizing, the charger or the battery? And ultimately that didn't make it into the last piece of the legislation. But those were two first steps of what I will call the VPP cupcake, if you will.
Wow.
And as I describe this to folks today, and a lot of my clients and others in the industry, when we start talking about standalone storage in particular and how does it play in the VPP, I view the ITCs for the storage asset, the DG rebate, and capacity reduction
Hang
as
on, hang on just a second, Scott. Let's break that down. ITC is the investment tax credit,
tax
right?
credit.
And
Yes.
that's granted to storage through the federal government, right?
Yep. That's still
Through those
available through
yeah.
2032, those tax credits. Our DG rebate, the distributed generation rebate I just talked about, which is at $250 per kilowatt hour of installed capacity. And then we also have this provision that we put in place shortly after CEJA, which we're the only market, and I say we, I still cannot refer to myself as anything other than a ComEd person, so apologies. It's actually put in place at ComEd, but I had a hand in it, where a resource that is operating during the peak hours of the day in ComEd will register as a negative peak load contribution, meaning that on the hourly rate, if you're negative, you can be paid for capacity because you're reducing capacity for everybody in the service territory. So those were
Scott, excuse me for before you go on to sort of summarize those benefits. I just want to stop here. Something we've never really discussed on the podcast. Capacity in common parlance, so to speak, is just a capability, an amount of something, amount of energy, amount of ability to put out fires, amount of capacity to build a building. But that's not how you're using it. You're using capacity as the energy that's needed during peak periods. That capacity is a higher value energy than other energy at other times on the system. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, for the most part, I would agree with that. And to put it into context, in PJM, the RT, the regional transmission organization that ComEd is a part of, runs an annual capacity auction to
Yeah.
get capacity resources to serve the peak demand. And ComEd, as a utility, has to allocate those costs to individual customers. And ComEd does that by every customer's contribution to the peak. And what that means is if you can be negative during the peak, you can get paid capacity by other customers by providing that capacity to other customers.
Because you've
And
saved the cost of capacity, right? You've saved some of the cost of capacity,
because you
right?
have literally reduced capacity on the system because
Right.
you were a producer versus a consumer at that time of the system peak. So when I go back to the VPP cupcake, the
Yeah.
three main elements, what I call the cupcake, are the tax credit, the DG rebate, and the capacity avoidance payment. Energy
Okay.
arbitrage, which a lot of standalone storage facilities are going to do because they're going to charge off peak in the middle of the night and discharge on peak during the day when prices are higher, are going to get some value of revenue from doing that charging, discharging, and advantageous hours. That I call the icing on the cupcake.
Ah,
And then the program that you talked about, which is the scheduled dispatch, the VPP program, where ComEd will pay $10 per kilowatt on average capacity. It's really just to encourage standalone storage and solar plus storage owners to be discharging their systems at times of system peak. For example, a customer with a solar plus storage system would generally want to take the power from their storage system to avoid distribution system credits to maximize the revenues. So the $10 payment to that solar plus storage owner is to have them change their mode of operation on their solar plus storage system from minimize exports to maximize exports during those hours. So we get more power back on the grid coming from these systems at the hours where the grid needs that power in order to reduce the capacity obligation of the utility. And that's
Now, let me just interrupt you again, Scott. I want to make clear to our listeners. So that's the seasonal scheduled dispatch program. That's the first of the two programs that Illinois lawmakers put into the bill. And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, that starts this year. And it's because the lawmakers were recognizing that this was represented a great deal of value to customers and a great deal of ability to start right away bringing the cost of electricity down. And that leaves the other program. We haven't really described it too much. That starts in a couple of years. Am I right about what seasonal scheduled dispatch is for that? And that's why the lawmakers had that one program?
I I would I'd probably say it a little differently. Um,
Say
uh,
it.
and that the reason it's starting sooner is it's the easiest one to figure out how to actually implement, and we had a clear line of sight on how to do that.
Ah,
So I think it was really a transition. I'm going to be 100% honest with you. When I look at what I break them down very simply into VP1 and VPP2, and you're describing them much more articulately than I can because I can't quite figure out at this point in time how the second one's actually going to work. And
ah,
because there's some provisions in Surgia that require customers that are part of the VPP program to be on certain rates. Like if you have a standalone storage device, you need to be on the ComEd hourly rate or on an hourly rate with an alternative supplier. And the reason for that is because if you're going to charge your battery at night and discharge it during the day, there should be a different type of price for when you're charging it off peak than when you're charging it on peak. But ComEd has multiple rates available to customers, and our default supply rate, the rate that customers get without picking anything else, is a flat rate. So if you're on a flat rate for energy and you charged and discharge, you're actually going to pay more for that energy than you otherwise would because your battery loses some power between charging and discharging. So it ends up being a net cost to the customer versus a net benefit. And an individual
oh,
customer on default supply can't really reduce your peak load contribution because it's all peanut butter spread all over customers that are in that default supply. So trying to put these mechanisms in place that encourage customers to do things in a way that is beneficial to others becomes more complicated when everybody's in the same pot versus in an hourly pot.
do you think that there will be now the long-term VPP program, that's VPP2 to you? Sometimes I've heard people call it storage for all. Do you think that before that won't be started, I think, until 2028, if I understand correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong, but my question is, do you think that ComEd and Ameren, I guess, will introduce time of use rates that complement the best use of the of VPPs or battery, V2G EV batteries and homes solar plus storage systems by the time 2028 rolls around and that VPP program gets initiated? Do you think there'll be different rates that'll complement that?
They're already there. ComEd has had an hourly rate in place for residential customers since 2007, and Ameren's had to offer the same rate. Currently, when I left ComEd, there are around 60,000 customers out of the 3.7 million or 4.2 million customers in ComEd that were on it because there are some commercial and industrial customers that are on it in addition to residential. So those rates are there. There's a new supply time of use rate that's going into effect in ComEd on June 1st. But actually, Herman, the very best rate to be on is the hourly rate because the hourly rate will change more frequently than the time of use rate. And that time of use rate comes with a hidden little surprise at the end, which is called a reconciliation, which means if the price of power needed to meet those time of use rates that are sort of administratively set, if the power can't be procured, then that cost of procuring the power that is unrecovered will be spread over all the members in the TOU, where the hourly rate, you are in complete control of your cost. You can take control of your energy cost structure, hedge it physically, behaviorally, but you're in complete control. You manage your own risk and can manage those opportunities appropriately to your lifestyle and to the resources they have to do so.
think Illinois will make any effort to move customers to the more beneficial rates along with developing this second program?
We had talked about it for a while, but I think there's some resistance for folks to accept the benefits of a default hourly rate. Everyone gets concerned about the price spikes and what the detriment of the price spikes are. I have a great example. Of course, I'm an energy nerd and steeped into this. But I started on the hourly rate at my new house in December of 2023, which was right when Winter Storm Elliott hit. And I will tell you, being on the hourly rate in the middle of Winter Storm Elliott cost me $50. That was the cost. Over the full 3 years that I've been on it, I've saved $800 net of the $50 of cost in Winter Storm Elliott. And that's because, one, I'm an EV owner that only charges my car at night. And a lot of time when I'm putting power into my car, it's at $0.015 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour versus 10 cents, which is the around the clock rate for ComEd. So the potential savings are dramatic, and the behavioral changes you have to do aren't that dramatic at all. We even did an analysis at one point at ComEd, and we said if we put every customer on the hourly rate, what would they do? Well, they'd save about 10% on average. And the reason for that is because embedded in your default supply procurement is a risk premium that a supplier is adding on to the cost of the energy in order to hedge their cost. So it tends to be more beneficial for a customer to do your own hedge generally than pay somebody to hedge it for you. But I'm a little off track for you, but
Yeah,
but it's a
it's an odd
key.
situation. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Scott, but I'm kind of
No,
beginning to wonder if you're somewhat not as optimistic as others might be about the effectiveness of these VPPs if this rate issue is an obstacle.
no. What I am very optimistic of VPP one. I think VPP one is going to be pretty dramatic on the system, and to put it in perspective, another part of Surge was to unlock contracts for utility scale storage devices. So it was a index storage credit approach for utility scale devices. I'm on record at multiple events saying that I will for put a pretty expensive bottle of bourbon on the fact that there will be more distributed generation standalone storage devices connected to ComEd's grid by 2030 than there will be utility scale storage devices on ComEd's grid. And
Wow.
that's because a standalone storage device doesn't have to navigate the PJM interconnection queue in order to get onto the grid. And ComEd's interconnection process um, is going to be much quicker, and it's going to be much easier for these guys. That I think the underlying question on storage connected to the distribution system, Herman, is going to be permitting and whether municipalities see lithium ion as a problem or not. I think right now, I don't think they're thinking about it at all. So I think it's going to be easy for first movers to get in. But the point of what I'm talking about around the rates and the settlement structures that ComEd has is that I tend to believe those are much more important to getting an effective marketplace together for these distributed resources than the VPP thing at the end. I think the VPP thing in the end is sort of administrative in general and not um, as much economically an economic carrot to kind of get people to behave. But I think what we're going to try to do is demonstrate to everyone, and these are a lot of the clients that I'm working with, is how do you take these things that are in place in ComEd and use them to the advantage of all customers by trying to what I call destroy the demand curve. If you can't add utility scale resources quick enough to meet the needs of the AI and the uh, new load that's coming from
Large
AI,
loads. Yeah.
yeah, the large loads, you've got to find resources on the distribution system. And to put this in perspective, I'll just give you a very fine point on this. In the ComEd zone from 20,000 from 2020 to 2026, ComEd had only added 900 megawatts of utility scale renewable generation to the system. In that same period, we had added about 1.6 gigawatts of distributed generation between community solar and rooftop solar.
Mm.
So the path to power, the speed to power in the ComEd zone in that marketplace is on the distributed side. And it's largely because you can move quickly through the distribution queue versus through the utility scale interconnection queue at PJM.
Okay. Let me first I want to mention to our listeners that you were one of the prime movers early on. It must have been a decade ago of community solar in Illinois. We're not here to talk about that, but I just want to mention that um, we're we've had a much more interesting and a different conversation than I expected to have, Scott. I want to quickly explain to people the two programs, the one you SSD, which you are very optimistic about, and the other one which you can't figure out how it's going to run yet. How do we know how DER owners are going to benefit? They're going to get incentives, like you said, and the cupcake of benefits. How do these programs benefit people who don't own EVs or solar plus storage? Um, that's another important feature of these. And if you could answer that one, then we'll move to the one more question that I want to get in. But that's really the next question. Where do the benefits come from for everybody else, or is this just a program for people have those things?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In my view, and this is what I was really working hard to do at ComEd, which is these distributed generation resources are reducing the demand curve because they're under 5, 7 megawatts in demand. PJM sort of they won't look at them as utility scale supply resources. They're on the distribution curve. Or the demand curve on their distribution on the demand curve. So if you can reduce the demand curve, you can reduce your capacity obligation. If you reduce the capacity obligation, you pay initially less dollars for capacity for the zone. Also, if you reduce the demand curve, in addition to reducing the overarching capacity obligation because you're buying less megawatts, you're reducing the price of those megawatts because of the sliding scale of distributed or of the way the capacity auction works and the way it clears. So for every marginal megawatt of less procurement you're doing, you're reducing the price because you're going into a new bidder at a different price point. So that's the complicated way that I see to maximize the benefits for customers. In addition to that, from the energy arb gets a little more complicated because you're going to charge the batteries off peak, which is going to increase off peak prices. But most residential customers aren't using power off peak in the middle of the night too much. So they're not too negatively impacted. But when they're discharging during the day, they're reducing the price on peak where most residential customers are buying power. So it's this price manipulation is probably too strong of a word, but you're impacting the price of power as well as the amount of capacity that you have to buy in the grid to serve other customers, and that's the way that other customers will benefit from these things. So, to the extent possible, I would like all the market forces to pay for the benefits or to pay the providers of these resources for their revenues. But to the extent that other customers are getting a benefit from price suppression and other things, then it justifies. And that's why I think in the first phase, it's a relatively minimal amount at $10 per kilowatt to get these um, solar plus storage devices to export at a time when maybe their best option would actually be to continue to hold the storage and use later for their own purposes. But this way we can benefit everybody if they're exporting all at once. The other aspect of it, I think that you were talking about in the VPP1, we're also trying to encourage community solar projects to install storage. And to give the example of that in the ComEd service territory, most people don't know this. Most of our community solar projects are oversized from a DC system basis, meaning that they have basically a 3-to-2 DC to AC ratio. So they have the ability to produce more hours at maximum AC performance with their inverter. But in many instances, in the afternoon when the sun's the highest and the production on that DC panel is the most, they're doing something called clipping, where at the inverter the power is being clipped and just pumped into the ground. So we're trying to encourage storage devices on those community solar projects so that instead of clipping, they capture the power, put it into the battery, and release the power later in the day. This is something I call firming. If we can get a community solar project to look like a 16-hour firmed 5 megawatt AC asset, then you're putting more peaking power on the grid and stabilizing the grid instead of using gas peakers so you can decarbonize and probably put cheaper power on the grid on something coming from solar plus storage than using a gas peaker.
Interesting. Scott, we're almost out of time. I just want to, what would you, one more thing that I want to ask you as briefly as you can without holding back the enormous amount of invaluable information that you have. What would you say were the key barriers, political barriers, regulatory barriers that utilities and other stakeholders had to figure out how to address to put these VPP VPP programs in place. And by the way, it sounds like there's still some in that VPP2 category that have to be figured out. What would you say are the key things to look at?
Uh, the way I approached it, and I think this was um, one of the challenges, because I think a lot of times when you're dealing with the legislators are reacting to legislation that's being proposed, and they're not experts in the marketplace. So there's a lot of negotiation going on between the utilities and your non-government organizations, and your developer community. And what the legislators really wanted was, hey, can everybody get to agreement on this? And if you get the utilities to agree with the developers, and you get the consumer advocates and the others to say, okay, well, if those guys are aligned, we can push something through. I think that's the biggest challenge. So the way I always approached this, Herman, when I was working at ComEd, was trying to find the common ground of what are we trying to do. And if we can agree on the goal, then let me tell you about the market structures that are in place and see if I can align the incentives between the utilities and the different stakeholder groups. And it's often a challenge. Sometimes I would say that the negotiations are toughest inside of a utility than outside the utility. But in certain cases, because a lot of times my experience is people get infatuated with terms and letters and terminology, and I would try to ignore what somebody wanted to call it and say, well, what are we trying to do? And what are the market structures we need to make them work? And I think Illinois is very unique in that. And I think even ComEd may be more unique than most in that we were able to see how do we leverage these different resources in a way to the benefit of other customers. And sometimes you have to first break down the barrier with the developer community that maybe the executive you're talking to at the utilities not just going to throw up a wall and give you a no, but is actually trying to help you get to a market reality that'll make your business work and pencil. But so I don't know. It's complicated. Politics are complicated.
No, I
As you,
understand. And as with everything else in this conversation, Scott, you've given us more than what I asked for. You gave us not the specific barriers, but the way to think about approaching those barriers that has clearly been effective because uh, Illinois has passed three major energy pieces of legislation in the last few years. The Future Energy Jobs Act, I think it is, and the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and now the SERGA, so that we've been talking about here. We're going to have to leave it there, Scott. Is that all right with you?
I, it's fine with me, Herman. I appreciate the time, and as you know, I tend to be long-winded, so apologies if we didn't get to all your questions.
No, we got to all of our questions and more. I got to thank you. My guest has been Scott Vogt. He's now principal with power sector consultant Vogt Energy Advisors. He's described the groundbreaking VPP programs he and other Illinois stakeholders put in place with SERGA, or some people say SERGA. I also want to thank our sponsor, Energy Hub. And as always, I want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown, and our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.